You wake up. It is somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, and you know this not because you have a clock, there are no clocks, but because the cold has become genuinely unbearable, and your body has decided that unconsciousness is no longer a viable strategy for dealing with it. The fire that was carefully banked last night has burned down to a faint orange glow in the hearth at the center of the room. The room itself is a single space, roughly the size of a modern two-car garage, in which you, your spouse, your 4 children, and your elderly mother-in-law are sleeping on straw-stuffed pallets arranged around the dying fire. There is also a pig in the corner. The pig is not a pet. The pig is a heating system. It is January, in England, in approximately the year 1270. Outside your walls, which are timber and wattle, and daub, not stone, because stone is for people who own more than you do. The temperature has dropped below freezing. There is snow on the ground. There has been snow on the ground since December, and there will be snow on the ground, give or take a brief thaw that will produce spectacular amounts of mud until late February or March. The wind coming through the gaps in your walls, and there are gaps because daub cracks, and you have not had the dry weather needed to properly repair it. Is the specific kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, but seems to reach inside your chest and squeeze. You get up, you feed the fire, you go back to your pallet and pull the rough wool blanket over yourself and the children, and you wait for morning, which will be better than this, only in the specific sense that it will be slightly lighter. This is winter, medieval winter. And if you are watching this video, you have probably heard at least one of the following things said about it. That people in the Middle Ages had an average life expectancy of 35, implying that surviving to 40 was some kind of miracle of personal fortitude. That they had no medicine, implying that every illness was a death sentence. That they were cold and hungry and miserable for roughly 5 months of every year. And that the fact that they survived at all is basically a testament to the incredible stubbornness of the human body. Some of these things are true, some of them are somewhat true, and some of them are the product of a way of looking at the past that flattens out the actual intelligence, adaptability, and accumulated knowledge of the people who lived it into a kind of background suffering that we observe with vague sympathy before going back to our central heating. Here is the thing about medieval peasants and winter that the popular account misses. They were not surprised by it. They were not caught off guard every single year by the revelation that it gets cold in December and the food doesn't grow and the water freezes. They knew winter was coming. They had always known winter was coming, and they spent the entire rest of the year preparing for it with a thoroughness and a sophistication that we consistently underestimate because we confuse no technology with no knowledge. They were wrong about a lot of things. They had a medical framework that was, in its fundamental assumptions, incorrect. The theory of the 4 humors, the belief that illness resulted from imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, the conviction that the position of the planets affected your health prospects. None of this maps onto what we now know about how the human body works. They had no antibiotics, no vaccines, no surgical anesthesia, no understanding of germ theory, no way to treat a serious infection except with prayers and herbs and hope. And yet they survived. Not all of them. The mortality statistics of the medieval period are genuinely sobering, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. But the majority of them survived year after year through winters that were sometimes significantly colder than anything most modern people in temperate climates have experienced. They survived through a combination of preparation, community, accumulated empirical knowledge about what worked, even when they didn't know why it worked, an almost unimaginable tolerance for discomfort, and this is the part that history books rarely give them credit for, genuine ingenuity. Today we are going to look at all of it. We are going to walk through the full picture of how a medieval peasant prepared for, endured, and survived a brutal winter. We are going to look at the food, the shelter, the heat, the clothing, the medicine, the community, and the psychological resources that got people through the darkest, coldest, most dangerous months of the year. We're going to start before winter begins, because the story of surviving winter starts in spring. You cannot understand January without understanding what happened in April, in May, in September, and October. Winter survival was not an emergency response. It was the result of a year-long strategy. Let's begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. The World Before November. How peasants spent all year preparing for winter. Everything in the medieval peasants' year was, in one sense or another, about winter. Not because winter was the only thing that mattered. Summer had its own crises, harvest its own anxieties, spring its own desperate urgency. But because winter was the fixed point around which everything else was organized. The agricultural year, the food preservation calendar, the management of animals and resources, the construction and maintenance of buildings, all of it was aimed, with varying degrees of consciousness, at the same target, arriving in December with enough of the right things to still be alive in March. Let's walk through the year and see how this worked. Spring arrived not with relief, but with a specific agricultural emergency, the fields, that had lain fallow or under winter grain through the cold months needed to be plowed, harrowed, and planted before the optimal window closed. This window was not flexible in the way that modern agriculture, with its mechanical equipment and weather forecasting, can sometimes be. A medieval peasant who missed his planting window by 2 weeks because the oxen were sick or the ground hadn't dried sufficiently didn't have a contingency plan. He had a worse harvest, and a worse harvest in November meant a harder winter, possibly a dangerous one. The spring plowing was therefore conducted with a sense of urgency that is difficult to appreciate from a modern vantage point. The heavy plow, the karuka, with its iron coulter for cutting the soil and its mold board for turning the sod, was the central implement, and it required a team of oxen, usually between 4 and 8, to pull it effectively through the heavy clay soils of much of northern Europe. Oxen were expensive to keep and shared between households in many villages, which created a logistical coordination problem. Multiple families needed the plow team at the same time, in the same optimal window, and managing this coordination was one of the central administrative functions of the village community. But while the plowing occupied the men and the oxen, the women were doing something equally important for winter. The kitchen garden was being planted. The kitchen garden, the small cultivated plot immediately adjacent to the house, was where the household's vegetables, herbs, and soft fruits were grown, and it was managed primarily by women as part of the household economy. What got planted in the kitchen garden in spring determined what was available for drying, preserving, and storing against the winter. Parsnips, turnips, cabbages, leeks, onions, garlic, various legumes. These were the vegetables of the medieval kitchen garden, and they were chosen partly for their nutritional value and partly for their storability. You didn't grow delicate salad greens in a medieval kitchen garden. You grew things that could survive being stored in a root cellar for 4 months. The herb section of the kitchen garden was particularly important for winter preparation, because herbs were the primary medical resource of the medieval household, and many of them needed to be harvested at specific times and then dried for winter use. We will talk much more about medieval herbal medicine later, but for now note this. The woman who neglected her herb garden in summer was the woman who had fewer resources to treat illness in January, and she knew it. Summer was the season of maximum agricultural labor, the haymaking in June and July, the harvesting of the various grain crops from August through September, the management of the common pasture and the woodlands. But alongside the agricultural work, specific winter preparation activities were being conducted continuously. Fuel gathering was one of the most important and most time-consuming of these. The right to gather wood from the Lord's forest, the right of estovers in the legal language of the period, was one of the most carefully defined and most carefully guarded of the customary rights attached to peasant holdings, because wood was survival. Not just warmth, though warmth was essential, but cooking, which was how you made grains and legumes edible, which was how you stayed alive. A household that went into winter with insufficient fuel stocks was a household that faced a binary choice in February: burn your furniture or be cold. Wood gathering was therefore continuous through the warmer months. Fallen branches, dead wood, wood gathered from the management of hedgerows and coppiced trees. All of it was collected, dried, bundled, and stacked. The stack of firewood outside a medieval peasant's house was not just a domestic detail. It was a survival resource as literal and as critical as the grain in the barn, peat in areas where it was available. Ireland, Scotland, parts of northern England, the Low Countries, was cut in spring and summer when the ground was workable, stacked to dry through the warm months, and burned through the winter. Dried animal dung was also used as fuel in some areas, particularly where wood was scarce. The fuel question was never trivial, and the peasant family that ran out of fuel in February faced the same crisis as the one that ran out of food, a crisis that could be fatal. Autumn was the critical season, the pivot point on which the whole year turned. The harvest had to be completed, evaluated, and stored. The animals had to be assessed against the feedstocks available for winter. And then came one of the most significant decisions of the medieval agricultural year: the November slaughter. The November slaughter, sometimes called Martinmas, falling around St. Martin's Day on November 11th, was the annual reckoning between the livestock population and the fodder supply. Medieval peasant households typically kept a range of animals: cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, geese, perhaps a goat or two. These animals had grazed on the common pasture through the summer, but common pasture was not available in winter, and the hay and other stored fodder that would keep animals alive through the cold months was a limited resource that had to be carefully managed. The calculation was brutally simple. Count the fodder you have, count the animals you have, determine how many animals the fodder can support through winter, and slaughter the rest. The animals that were too old to be productive, too weak to survive the winter, or simply surplus to the fodder supply, were killed in November, and their meat was preserved. This was not a sad occasion, or not only a sad one. It was also the moment of greatest meat abundance that most medieval peasant households experienced all year. The slaughter produced quantities of fresh meat, offal, and other animal products that were not normally available in the daily diet. And the days around Martinmas were genuinely festive in many medieval communities, a celebration of autumn's end, of the harvest safely stored, of winter's larder filled. Ale was brewed for the occasion. Community gathering happened around the slaughter and the preservation work. The preservation of the November slaughter's meat was an urgent technical operation that had to be done correctly. Salt was the primary preservative, and salted meat, packed into barrels with layers of salt, or rubbed with salt and hung, could last through the winter if properly prepared. Smoking was another preservation technique, used particularly for hams and bacon, and the importance of the smoke-blackened beams of a medieval peasant cottage, where smoked meats hung as both food storage and decorative proof of household prosperity, cannot be overstated. The fat rendered from the slaughtered animals, particularly from the pig, which was the peasant's most important meat animal, was also carefully preserved. Rendered lard was used for cooking, for preserving other foods. Confiting, packing meat in fat, was a preservation technique that produced results similar to modern confit, and for various practical domestic purposes, including waterproofing and lubricating equipment. Nothing from the November slaughter was wasted. Not the blood, made into blood puddings and sausages. Not the offal, eaten immediately because it didn't preserve well. Not the head, brawn. Not the trotters. Not the bones, boiled for stock and marrow. The pig held a special place in the medieval peasant's winter economy, and it is worth dwelling on why. The pig, unlike cattle or sheep, could be fed on things that humans wouldn't or couldn't eat. Food scraps, kitchen waste, acorns from the woodland, the rite of pannage, allowing pigs to forage in the Lord's woods. In autumn was another carefully defined, customary rite: roots and refuse. The pig converted this low-value material into high-calorie meat and fat with extraordinary efficiency. A pig fed through the year on household scraps and woodland forage could, by November, provide a family with a substantial proportion of their winter protein and fat. This is why the pig was so central to the peasant household. Not as a pet, not as a status symbol, but as a food production system of remarkable efficiency. The grain stores were the other pillar of winter survival, and their management required careful calculation. The harvest had to provide seed grain for next year's planting. The most sacrosanct portion touched only in genuine emergency. Grain for making bread and pottage through the winter, grain for brewing ale, and grain for animal feed were necessary. Calculating how much grain was needed for each purpose and whether the harvest was sufficient for all of them was a genuine exercise in resource management, one that could be done wrong with serious consequences. The storage of grain was also a technical challenge. Grain stored in damp conditions grew mold. Grain stored in conditions accessible to rodents was consumed by rodents. Grain stored without adequate ventilation could heat up through microbial activity and spoil. The medieval grain store, typically a raised, ventilated structure separated from the ground to discourage rodent access, was a piece of practical engineering designed to address exactly these problems, and its proper management was a skill that was learned and taken seriously. By the end of October, the well-prepared medieval peasant household had its grain stores assessed and stored, its vegetable cellar stocked with root vegetables and cabbages, its herb stores dried and hung, its fuel stack built up, its smoked and salted meats in the barrel, its ale fermenting or newly brewed, its animals sorted between those that would be kept through winter and those that had already been slaughtered, and its house, as far as possible, repaired and insulated against the cold to come. Were all households in this position by the end of October? No. Households that had experienced bad harvests, illness, the death of a working adult, the loss of their ox team, or any of the dozen other agricultural disasters that the medieval year could produce, might arrive at winter under-provisioned, under-fueled, and genuinely frightened. These households were the ones for whom winter was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. We will talk about what happened to them and what the community and the church provided in terms of support. But the well-prepared household, the average household in an average year, arrived at November with enough to survive on, if managed carefully. Carefully is the key word. The management of winter stores was not a set it and forget it operation. It was a continuous daily exercise in rationing, monitoring, and adjustment that lasted from November through March. And the intelligence and discipline with which it was conducted was the difference between a hard winter and a catastrophic one. Now, the stores are in, the animals are sorted, the fuel is stacked, the house needs to be examined, because however well the stores are managed, none of it matters if the building that's supposed to protect you from the elements turns out to be somewhat theoretical on that front. Chapter 2. The house that barely kept you alive. Medieval peasant shelter and heat. Let's talk about the building you are going to spend most of the next 4 months inside. It is not impressive. I want to be honest with you about this up front, because there is a tempting narrative in which medieval peasants, despite their limited resources, built cozy, charming, well-crafted homes that provided genuine protection against the elements. Some of them did, but the majority of medieval peasant housing, the housing of the people, at the bottom of the social pyramid, the villeins and cottagers who make up the bulk of the rural population, was built primarily from the cheapest materials available locally, repaired intermittently as necessity demanded, and provided a level of weatherproofing that ranged from barely adequate to aspirational. The typical English peasant cottage of the 13th century was a longhouse, a single rectangular structure in which the human family and their most valuable animals, the cow, the ox, sometimes the pig in deepest winter, shared a single space, separated by nothing more than a low partition or a difference in floor level. This cohabitation arrangement is usually presented as a mark of primitive conditions, and in terms of modern hygiene standards, it absolutely was, but it was also a rational response to the problem of heat. Animals generate heat. A cow metabolically produces roughly the same warmth as a small space heater. Running continuously, an ox is similar. Several pigs together produce measurable warmth. A family that shared its winter sleeping space with its livestock was a family that was warmer than a family that didn't. And in January in England or France or Germany, warmer was not a comfort preference. It was a survival variable. The longhouse structure was almost universal across Northern Europe in the early and high medieval period, and its persistence in the face of obvious hygiene downsides is explained entirely by this thermal logic. When you don't have central heating and your fuel supply is limited and the temperature outside drops to -10, you take your heat sources where you find them. The animals were heat sources. The animals lived inside. The walls of the typical longhouse were timber framed, a skeleton of wooden posts and beams filled in with wattle and daub, woven twigs, the wattle, plastered over with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung, the daub. This wall construction, when fresh and properly maintained, was a reasonable insulator. The daub dried hard, filled the gaps between the woven wattle, and created a surface that kept most of the wind out most of the time. The problem was maintenance. Daub cracked. It cracked when it dried too fast, cracked when it froze, cracked when it got wet, and then dried, cracked when the timber frame settled or shifted. A crack in the daub was a direct pathway for cold air, and a wall with multiple cracks was effectively a wall with ventilation holes that nobody had asked for. Keeping the daub intact required periodic repair, replastering the cracked sections with fresh daub, which required dry weather for the repair to cure properly. In winter, dry weather was not always available, which meant that winter repairs were difficult, which meant that the cracks that developed in autumn might not be fully repaired until spring, which meant that the wall you were relying on to keep the winter out had a variable number of gaps in it through the coldest months. This is the kind of detail that makes medieval winter more uncomfortable than the outline suggests. The roof was thatched, a thick layer of straw or reed or heather laid over the timber roof structure in a way that sheds water and provides genuine insulation if done well. A good thatched roof was a genuinely effective insulator. The air trapped within the layers of thatch has reasonable thermal properties, and the thickness of a well-laid thatch could be substantial. A bad thatched roof, or an old one that had developed gaps and was beginning to let in rain, was a source of ongoing misery. The roof also required periodic maintenance and full replacement every 20 to 30 years, which represented a significant expenditure of labor and material. The floor was earth, beaten compacted earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw for insulation from the cold ground, and some degree of cleanliness. Earth floors were not sophisticated, but they were not simply primitive either. Beaten earth compacts to a remarkably hard surface. The rushes and straw strewn over it could be replaced when they became dirty. The earth floor was, in the context of the building technology available, a rational choice. Windows, if the cottage had them at all, were small openings in the wall, possibly covered with a wooden shutter that could be closed against the wind, possibly covered with oiled linen or scraped animal horn. Horn is somewhat translucent when scraped thin, allowing some light through, possibly just open. Glass windows were not a feature of peasant housing. Glass was expensive, and the economic calculation for a peasant cottage was clear. Windows that let in light also let in cold, and in winter, the warmth was more important than the light. This meant that a medieval peasant cottage in winter, with the shutters closed, was not just cold, it was dark. The light sources were the fire, the most significant source of both light and heat, tallow candles, expensive, used sparingly, and rush lights, rushes dipped in tallow, which burned quickly and dimly but cheaply. The medieval peasant's winter interior was a world of flickering, limited, unreliable light, and the darkness was as much a feature of the season as the cold. The fire was the heart of the medieval peasant house, in both the literal and the metaphorical sense. The central hearth, a flat area of stone or clay at the floor level of the main room, on which the fire burned, was the source of heat for the whole space, the cooking surface, the light source, and the social center of the household. In the later medieval period, wall fireplaces with chimneys became more common in peasant housing, improving smoke management considerably. But in the earlier period, the central hearth with a smoke hole in the roof was standard. The smoke management problem deserves attention because it was not trivial. A fire burning on a central hearth in an enclosed room produces a lot of smoke. Ideally, this smoke rises to the roof and exits through the smoke hole. In practice, smoke behavior in a real building with imperfect airflows, variable wind directions, and a smoke hole that may or may not be optimally positioned relative to the prevailing wind is considerably less predictable. The medieval peasant cottage interior was genuinely smoky, not catastrophically, because people adapted, and because the building had enough gaps and ventilation that the smoke eventually found its way out, but persistently, and the long-term effects of spending most of your life in a smoky interior environment were real and measurable in the remains of medieval people, whose lungs often show the soot deposits characteristic of chronic smoke inhalation. The upside of the smoky interior was that the smoke that rose into the thatch did something useful. It kept insects out of the thatch. It cured the meats that were hung from the rafters. This was not accidental. The proximity of the smoke to the hanging meat was deliberate, and it contributed to the preservation of the roof structure by keeping it dry and inhospitable to the rot-causing fungi that plague thatched buildings in damp climates. The medieval peasant's smoky home was, in this sense, a system. The smoke was not simply a tolerated nuisance, but a functional element of the building's food preservation and maintenance regime. Heat management in the medieval peasant cottage was an active, continuous process that required both knowledge and attention. You did not simply light a fire and leave it. The fire had to be managed, fed with the right combination of fuels to produce the right amount of heat for the current purpose, whether that was cooking, heating the space, or maintaining a low overnight burn that would be coaxed back to life in the morning, banked at night to conserve fuel while maintaining enough warmth to prevent the space from dropping to dangerous temperatures, and monitored for the dual hazards of going out, which meant cold and the expense of relighting, and getting out of control, which meant the cottage burning down, an extremely common and extremely serious medieval disaster. Fire in the medieval cottage was managed with tools: iron fire dogs to hold logs at the right angle, a poker for rearranging the coals, a bellows for encouraging the fire when it was reluctant, a cauldron hook over the fire for cooking. These tools were not luxuries. They were the hardware of the central heating and cooking system, and their management was a genuine skill. The specific fuel management strategy for winter deserves detail. Different fuels burn differently. Hardwoods, oak, ash, burn slowly and produce sustained heat. Softwoods burn faster and hotter, but for shorter periods. Peat burns slowly and steadily with a characteristic smell. Dry dung burns with less heat than wood, but is better than nothing. A medieval peasant household that had accumulated a variety of fuel types would manage them strategically, using faster burning fuel for cooking purposes where a hot, responsive fire was needed, slower burning fuel for overnight banking where sustained heat over many hours was the goal. The banked fire, deliberately covered with ash to insulate the glowing coals and slow their consumption of oxygen, was the overnight heat management strategy. A properly banked fire could maintain its coals for 8 to 10 hours, allowing the household to sleep without tending the fire and wake to something that could be revived into a working fire with a few minutes of careful work. The failure of the banked fire, coals that had gone completely cold overnight, was not just an inconvenience. It meant starting the fire from scratch with flint and steel and tinder, which was a significant undertaking, particularly with cold-numbed hands in a cold room, and which consumed time and tinder, itself a resource that had to be maintained. Insulation of the human body within this imperfectly heated space was achieved through layering, the same principle as modern thermal layering, applied with the materials available. Wool was the critical material. Multiple layers of wool retained body heat through a combination of its physical properties: the crimp of the fiber-trapped air. The lanolin, in less processed wool, provided some water resistance, and its practical properties: It retained warmth even when damp, which was frequently relevant. Sleeping under multiple wool blankets, possibly in a straw-stuffed mattress tick, possibly with other family members for additional warmth. This was the basic sleeping insulation strategy. The shared bed was not a mark of poverty in the sense that it is sometimes presented. It was a rational thermal strategy. Two bodies generate more heat than one. A family sleeping together under a shared pile of blankets was warmer than the same family sleeping separately, and warmth at night, the hours when the fire was banked low and the temperature in the room dropped toward outdoor levels, was a genuine survival consideration in the coldest months. The layout of the household's sleeping arrangement in winter often differed from summer. In winter, the family migrated toward the fire, pallets arranged in a semicircle around the hearth, bodies positioned to maximize exposure to the radiant heat while remaining out of the direct path of smoke. The animals in their end of the longhouse contributed their thermal presence to the whole space. The household formed a thermal community, a cluster of warm bodies sharing a limited supply of warmth against the cold outside. Some additional insulation techniques were applied to the building itself. Straw packed against the exterior base of the walls helped insulate the foundation from frost. Animal skins or fabric hung over interior doorways, reduced drafts. The earth floor was covered more thickly with rushes and straw in winter. These measures were not architectural sophistication. They were adaptive responses to the specific thermal challenges of the season, applied with the materials at hand. The medieval peasant cottage in winter was not warm by modern standards, but it was survivably warm. Warm enough that the people inside it didn't freeze to death, which was the basic requirement. It was smoky, it was dark, it smelled of animals and unwashed bodies, and damp wool and wood smoke, and the accumulated cooking of months. It was, in its way, a functional piece of thermal engineering, not elegant, not comfortable, but purpose-built for the specific challenge of keeping people alive through a northern European winter with no external energy supply beyond what the household could gather and store. Now, you are alive. You are in your house. You are, by the standards of your time and place, housed. The next question is, what are you eating? Chapter 3. What you ate when the ground was frozen solid. Here is the honest truth about medieval winter food. It was sufficient before it was interesting. By which I mean, the medieval peasants' winter diet was organized around one primary goal: providing enough calories and enough nutritional content to keep working adults and growing children alive and functional through the months when no fresh food was being produced. And that goal was met most years, by most households, through means that were effective without being particularly varied, flavorful, or enjoyable by modern culinary standards. If you were hoping for a story about medieval peasants discovering the secret to delicious winter cooking, you will find some of that here. Because medieval food was not as monotonous as its reputation suggests, and the ingenuity applied to winter food preparation was genuine. But if you were hoping that winter food was secretly great, you will be disappointed, because it was not secretly great. It was adequate. Adequacy was the goal, and adequacy was what the medieval winter kitchen was built to deliver. Let's start with the foundation, the absolute baseline of the medieval peasant's winter diet. The thing that provided the majority of calories on most days for most people was bread, pottage, and ale. This has been called the Holy Trinity of medieval peasant food. And while it sounds like damning with faint praise, it was actually a reasonably effective nutritional delivery system for a pre-industrial agricultural economy. Bread in the medieval period was not the white, soft, lightly structured loaf of modern baking. Medieval peasant bread was dark, dense, and heavy, made from whatever grain was available, which was most commonly rye, or a mixture of rye and wheat, or in difficult years, barley, or mixtures of grain and legume flours that produced a bread of indifferent quality but adequate calories. Rye. Bread, in particular, was dense, slightly sour from the sourdough fermentation that was the standard leavening method. Commercial yeast was not available. You kept your sourdough culture going, from one baking to the next, which was itself a responsibility, because a dead sourdough culture meant unleavened bread until you could establish a new one, and nutritionally more substantial than white wheat bread, because the bran and germ were included. The quality of the bread varied with the quality of the grain. Grain stored through autumn into winter could develop mold if the storage conditions were imperfect, and moldy grain produced bread that ranged from unpleasant to actively dangerous. The ergot fungus, which infects rye in particular under certain conditions, produces alkaloids that cause ergotism, a condition whose symptoms include convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrenous loss of limbs, and which was responsible for epidemic outbreaks in medieval communities that were later interpreted as mass possessions or supernatural events. Eating contaminated grain was a genuine winter hazard, and the ability to distinguish acceptable grain from dangerously contaminated grain was a real skill. Pottage was the medieval soup stew that constituted the second element of the daily diet, and it was considerably more variable in content than bread. At its simplest, pottage was grain, or legumes, boiled in water with whatever vegetables and herbs were available, the thick, filling, porridge-like dish that appears in virtually every description of medieval peasant food. In winter, the legumes were the dried peas and beans that had been stored through the autumn. The vegetables were the root vegetables from the cellar, parsnips, turnips, onions, leeks, and the preserved herbs. On days when the household had it, a piece of salted pork or a ham bone went into the pottage, transforming it from a purely vegetable dish into something with genuine fat and protein content. The ham bone, simmered for hours in the pottage pot, contributed collagen, marrow, and flavor to the broth, even after the meat itself had been consumed, and a good ham bone could make pottage acceptable for several successive meals. The caloric arithmetic of medieval pottage was important and carefully managed. A bowl of legume pottage with some vegetables and a piece of salted pork provided roughly the caloric content of a modern bowl of hearty soup, perhaps 300 to 400 calories. And eaten with a thick slice of bread, it constituted a meal that was adequate in calories, if not in every nutritional dimension. 2 such meals a day, plus bread consumed as a staple throughout the day, produced a caloric intake that was sufficient for moderate activity in winter conditions. Ale was the third element, and it was not consumed primarily for recreational purposes, though that dimension was not absent. Medieval ale was the standard safe drinking liquid in a world where water sources were frequently contaminated, and the concept of boiling water as a purification technique was understood but not universally practiced. Ale's alcohol content, even at the modest levels of medieval brewing, was sufficient to inhibit most of the bacterial growth that made untreated water sources dangerous. It also provided calories. Ale is nutritionally more substantial than water, containing carbohydrates, some B vitamins, and a modest alcohol content that has mild cardiovascular effects. The winter ale was typically brewed from the grain stores, using barley or oats that had been malted, allowed to begin germinating to develop enzymes that convert starch to sugar, mashed with hot water, fermented with the wild yeasts that were present in the brewing environment, and drunk relatively young, because medieval ale without hops didn't keep well. A household that brewed regularly through the winter had a continuous supply of low-alcohol ale, much lower alcohol than modern beer, perhaps 2 to 4%, that provided hydration, calories, and a reliable supply of something that was safer than the winter water supply. Beyond this trinity, the winter diet included a range of preserved foods whose management was one of the primary strategies for getting through the cold months with adequate nutrition. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils were perhaps the most nutritionally important element of the medieval peasants' winter food stores. Legumes, when dried, could be stored for years without significant nutritional loss, and they provided protein and complex carbohydrates in quantities that the grain-heavy winter diet otherwise lacked. Peas in particular were a winter staple. Dried peas boiled into peas pottage, or peas pudding, were a regular feature of the winter diet. and their high protein content made them an important supplement to what was otherwise a relatively protein-poor diet. Salted and smoked meat provided the fat and protein that winter working bodies needed, and the management of the salt meat stores through the winter was a delicate operation. The salt that preserved the meat also made it intensely salty. Before eating, salt meat typically needed to be soaked in water for hours or days to draw out excess salt to a palatable level. This soaking process also helped rehydrate the meat, making it more tender. The cook who knew how to properly prepare salt meat, how long to soak it, how to cook it to best effect, how to integrate it with vegetables and legumes in pottage, was managing a significant food resource with skill. Fish, particularly salted herring and dried cod, was an important winter protein source, particularly in coastal regions and during the Lenten fast, the 40 days before Easter, during which eating meat was prohibited by the church. Lent fell in late winter and early spring, exactly the period when meat stores were most depleted, and the church's requirement to abstain from meat at this moment was either spectacularly well-timed or spectacularly poorly timed, depending on your perspective. The result was that fish, specifically preserved fish that could be stored and transported, was a critical element of the winter diet. Salted herring was perhaps the most democratic food in medieval Europe, cheap enough that even poor households could afford it, available enough through the trade networks that distributed it from the herring-rich North Sea to the interior of the continent, nutritionally substantial enough, high in protein, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, though medieval people knew nothing about omega-3 fatty acids or vitamin D to make a real contribution to the winter diet. A barrel of salted herring in the cellar was a meaningful food security asset. Dried cod, stockfish as it was called, was the other major fish staple. Dried in the cold, dry air of the Norwegian coast and exported across Europe, stockfish was an extraordinarily durable, preserved food that kept for years if properly stored. It was also very nutritionally dense, being essentially concentrated protein and fat with most of the water removed. Before eating, stockfish had to be soaked for an extended period, sometimes days, to rehydrate it, and then beaten to tenderize the extremely firm texture. The beating of stockfish was such a standard kitchen operation that special implements were made for it, and the sound of stockfish being beaten against a stone would have been recognizable in many medieval winter kitchens. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, which were more commonly purple or white in the medieval period than the orange carrot we know today, the orange variety being a later development, and beets were the winter vegetables that came from the cellar. Stored in cool, dark, slightly moist conditions, root vegetables could keep through much of the winter with reasonable success, though they gradually deteriorated in texture and nutritional content as the months passed. The vegetables available in February from a cellar stocked in October were considerably less appealing than they had been when first stored. Softer, sometimes beginning to sprout, occasionally developing unpleasant textures, but they were still edible and still nutritionally meaningful. Cabbages, if properly stored, heads wrapped and kept in cool conditions, could survive several months. Fermented cabbage, the medieval equivalent of sauerkraut, produced by packing shredded cabbage in salt and allowing it to ferment in its own brine, was a winter food that had both preservation and nutritional advantages. Fermented vegetables contain beneficial bacteria, what we would now call probiotics, and the fermentation process preserves and even increases certain vitamins. Medieval peasants who ate fermented vegetables through the winter were getting nutritional benefits that their contemporaries with access only to salt meat and dried legumes were missing. Onions and garlic kept well through winter and were used extensively. Beyond their culinary value, both onions and garlic have genuine antimicrobial properties. Not enough to substitute for antibiotics, but real enough to make them useful additions to a winter diet, where bacterial illness was a constant threat. Medieval people used garlic medicinally as well as culinarily, prescribing it for a range of conditions, and modern research has confirmed that its active compound allicin, has genuine antibacterial and antiviral properties. Honey was the primary sweetener of the medieval period, and it was used both culinarily and medicinally. Stored honey does not spoil. It is hygroscopic and acidic enough that bacteria cannot survive in it. And a household with a supply of honey had both a sweetener for the winter diet and a medicinal resource, since honey has genuine wound-healing properties. It's high. Sugar concentration, acidity, and hydrogen peroxide content make it effective against many common bacteria that were exploited by medieval healers. Cheese was another important winter food. Hard cheeses, produced through the summer from the milk of cattle, sheep, and goats when those animals were producing, could be aged and stored through the winter, providing fat and protein in a form that was considerably more palatable than salt meat and considerably more varied than dried legumes. The quality of stored winter cheese varied. A well-made hard cheese could be excellent, even by modern standards. A poorly made or improperly stored cheese developed mold, off flavors, or textures that required significant culinary optimism to work through. Medieval cheeses were not the refined products of modern artisan cheesemaking. They were functional food preservation, and they were consumed as such. Eggs were available through much of the winter from hens that were kept inside or in covered runs, though egg production dropped significantly in winter because daylight reduction suppresses laying in most breeds. The medieval household that had managed to maintain its laying hens through the cold months had a periodic fresh food source that provided a meaningful nutritional supplement to the otherwise entirely preserved winter diet. The management of the winter food stores was a daily exercise in rationing that required both discipline and arithmetic. The household that ate freely from its stores in November and December because the food was there would find itself running short in February and March, the hungry gap of early spring before the first fresh food of the new year became available. The hunger of early spring was a specific, recognized feature of the medieval year, documented in chronicles and visible in the seasonal patterns of mortality data. Deaths from malnutrition, related causes, peaked in late winter and early spring, when stores were depleted and the new season's food was not yet available. Managing toward the hungry gap, rationing the winter stores so that something remained through the most dangerous period, was one of the most important strategic challenges of the medieval household, and the intelligence and discipline with which it was managed made the difference between households that were hungry in March and households that were in genuine nutritional crisis. There was also, in most medieval communities, a social safety net of sorts. We will discuss this more fully in the context of community survival strategies. But it is worth noting here that the complete exhaustion of winter stores was not purely an individual household failure. It was a community crisis that the community, through its various mechanisms, was expected to address. The Lord, the church, and the village community all had roles in the emergency food distribution that occurred when specific households faced a genuine shortage. This did not always work, and it did not always work well. But the system existed, and it provided some protection to the households most at risk. The winter diet was, in summary, calorie adequate in good years, nutritionally limited throughout, deficient in specific vitamins, particularly vitamin C, vitamin D, and fresh B vitamins, in ways that had real health consequences, and increasingly monotonous as the months progressed. The medieval peasant who made it to March was ready, in every possible sense, for spring. Chapter 4. The Medicine Cabinet of the Desperate. What passed for healthcare in winter. You are sick. This is not a metaphor. You woke up this morning with a throat that feels like someone has been sanding it from the inside, a chest that produces a wet, rattling cough every few minutes, and a fever that has made the already dim interior of your cottage seem to pulse and shimmer in a way that the tallow candle definitely doesn't account for. Your joints ache, your head throbs. You are, by any diagnostic standard, unwell. It is February. It is 1283. The nearest physician an actual university-trained doctor with a degree from a medical faculty, is in the city, roughly 40 miles away, and even if you could get to him, which you cannot because the roads are ice and mud, and you can barely stand up, his fee for a consultation would represent a significant fraction of your annual household income. The nearest apothecary is in the market town, 12 miles away, also not accessible. What you have in terms of medical resources is this: your wife's knowledge, your mother-in-law's knowledge, the dried herbs hanging from your rafters, the honey in the earthenware pot by the fire, the local woman in the village who is known for her healing skill, and, if the situation gets genuinely serious, the priest who can pray, administer last rites if necessary, and possibly write to the monastery, 3 villages over where one of the brothers is reputed to know something about medicine. This is your medical system. It is not nothing, but it is not what you would choose. Let's understand what it actually consisted of, because the popular account of medieval medicine, all leeches and superstition and useless herb teas, is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Medieval medicine was genuinely limited by its theoretical framework, genuinely dangerous in some of its specific practices, and genuinely effective in others. The key is knowing which was which, and in the case of winter illness, the balance is more interesting than the caricature suggests. The theoretical framework of medieval medicine was humoral theory, inherited from Greek medicine via Galen and Hippocrates, and transmitted through the medieval period in Latin translation. The theory held that the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose proper balance constituted health and whose imbalance constituted disease. Each humor was associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, specific seasons, specific organs, and specific temperamental types. Blood was hot and wet, associated with spring and the heart, and its excess produced a sanguine temperament. Phlegm was cold and wet, associated with winter and the brain, and its excess produced a phlegmatic temperament, and so on. In winter, according to humoral theory, phlegm was the dominant humor, cold and wet, corresponding to the cold and wet qualities of the season. This made winter the season of phlegmatic illness. The colds, the coughs, the chest complaints, the running noses and thick mucus, and the general sense of being waterlogged from the inside that characterized winter illness. And here is the interesting thing: this theoretical framework, while fundamentally wrong about mechanism, was observationally accurate in its description of the pattern. People do get more colds and respiratory infections in winter. They do produce more phlegm. The symptom pattern that humoral theory described as excess phlegm is, in modern terms, the inflammatory response to viral respiratory infection. The theory was wrong about why. It was right about what. This distinction matters for evaluating medieval medicine, because much of what medieval healers prescribed for phlegmatic winter illness was aimed at countering the cold and wet qualities of the offending humor. Warming and drying treatments in humoral terms: hot drinks, warm foods, heating spices, rest in a warm environment. And while the theoretical justification for these treatments was humoral nonsense, the treatments themselves were, in many cases, genuinely helpful. Hot drinks are genuinely helpful for respiratory illness. They provide hydration, which is important when fever is causing fluid loss. They soothe irritated mucous membranes. The steam from a hot drink provides a degree of inhalation therapy that reduces congestion. A medieval patient told to drink hot herbal infusions was being told to do something that actually helped, even though the explanation given, counteracting the cold, wet qualities of excess phlegm, had nothing to do with the actual mechanism. Rest in a warm environment is genuinely helpful for most illness because it conserves the energy the immune system needs and keeps the patient from the cold exposure that makes most respiratory infections worse. A medieval physician prescribing rest and warmth was prescribing what modern medicine would also prescribe for most viral respiratory illness for completely different reasons. The herbs were where things got particularly interesting because medieval herbal medicine was built on centuries of accumulated empirical observation. People noticing that specific plants, used in specific ways, produced specific effects on specific conditions. And some of those observations were accurate in ways that the theoretical framework used to justify them could not explain. Let's go through the winter medicine chest and see what was actually there and what it actually did. Garlic we have already mentioned in the context of food, but its medical use deserves specific attention. Garlic contains allicin, which is produced when the garlic is crushed or cut, and which has genuine antibacterial properties. Medieval healers prescribed garlic for infections, wounds, chest complaints, intestinal problems, and the prescription was not wrong in its basic effect. Garlic doesn't cure serious bacterial infections, but it has real antimicrobial activity against a range of bacteria, and using it as a treatment for minor infections was not pure superstition. It was imprecise empiricism. Honey, as noted, has genuine wound-healing properties and some antimicrobial activity. Its use in treating sore throats, coating the irritated mucous membrane, providing some antimicrobial effect, reducing the pain of swallowing, was genuinely helpful. Honey mixed with hot water and perhaps some vinegar, oxymel, was a standard medieval throat preparation that combined several genuinely beneficial elements. Modern medicine has produced clinical evidence that honey is effective for cough suppression in children, outperforming some over-the-counter cough syrups. The medieval healer who gave honey to a coughing patient was doing something that works. Thyme was used for chest complaints and coughs. Thyme contains thymol, which has genuine antiseptic and expectorant properties. It helps loosen and clear mucus from the airways. Modern medicine uses thymol as an active ingredient in some cough preparations. A thyme infusion, drunk as a hot tea, provided real expectorant benefit alongside the general benefits of a hot drink. Elderberry was used for fevers and respiratory illness. Modern research has confirmed that elderberry extracts have genuine antiviral activity against influenza viruses and some other respiratory pathogens, apparently by interfering with the virus's ability to penetrate host cells. The medieval healer who prescribed elderberry for respiratory illness was prescribing something that actually worked through a mechanism that would not be understood for another 700 years. Willow bark, prescribed for pain and fever, contains salicylate compounds that are chemically related to aspirin's active ingredient. A willow bark infusion genuinely reduces fever and relieves pain. It is a slow and imprecise delivery method compared to a standardized aspirin tablet, and the dose is variable, but the pharmacological effect is real. Medieval patients who received willow bark for fever were receiving something that actually lowered their temperature. Mullein was used for chest complaints and coughs. Mullein has genuine expectorant and anti-inflammatory properties that make it helpful for the kind of productive cough associated with winter respiratory illness. Its large, soft leaves were sometimes used as a kind of early chest plaster, heated and applied to the chest to provide warmth and perhaps some anti-inflammatory benefit through the skin. Yarrow was used for wounds, for fever, and for various internal complaints. Yarrow has genuine antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, and its use in wound treatment was not without basis. Ginger, available as an imported spice, was used for digestive complaints and for warming the body. Ginger has genuine anti-nausea properties, confirmed by modern clinical research, and its use for digestive distress was well-founded. Now let's be clear about where medieval medicine failed, because it failed in ways that were not trivial. Bloodletting, the withdrawal of blood from the patient through opening a vein or through the application of leeches, was one of the most universally practiced medical interventions of the medieval period, and it was, with very few exceptions, harmful. The logic was humoral. If the patient had excess blood, or if the blood was corrupted, removing some of it would restore balance. For patients who were already weakened by illness, bloodletting removed the red blood cells that the immune system needed and reduced the blood pressure that oxygenated the tissues. It made sick people sicker, and in some cases, it killed people who might otherwise have survived. The persistence of bloodletting, despite its manifest failure to produce positive results, is one of the most striking features of pre-modern medicine, and it persisted because the theoretical framework made it seem logical, because the alternative explanations, the patient died because the disease was too advanced, not because the treatment was wrong, were always available, and because the confirmation bias of the practitioner, remembering the cases where patients got better and forgetting the cases where they got worse, prevented systematic learning from negative outcomes. Purging, the use of strong laxatives to empty the bowel, on the theory that expelling corrupt humors would restore health, was similarly harmful in most contexts. For a patient who was already dehydrated from fever, a violent purging produced dangerous fluid loss that worsened the condition. The plants used as purging agents were genuinely powerful. Hellebore, for instance, which was used as a purge, is a toxic plant whose active compounds produce violent gastric effects. And the line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic one was not clearly understood. Applying heat through various means, hot iron, cautery, to wounds and infected areas was sometimes used to stop bleeding. Cautery does work for this purpose, and sometimes used to treat infections on the theory that the heat would drive out the corrupt humors. Heating an infected wound does kill some surface bacteria, but it also damages tissue and can drive the infection deeper, and the net effect was variable at best and harmful at worst. The diagnosis of illness through uroscopy, examining the patient's urine for color, clarity, odor, and other properties, was a standard medical practice that was almost entirely useless in the specific ways it was practiced. Urine does contain diagnostic information, but the humoral framework for interpreting it was not a system for extracting that information accurately. The physician who examined a flask of urine and pronounced on the patient's humoral state was performing theater rather than medicine, and the theatrical aspect of the performance, the serious examination, the authoritative pronouncement, may have had some psychological benefit, while the medical content was essentially zero. Astrology played a role in medical diagnosis and treatment timing that is difficult to evaluate charitably. The position of the planets was believed to affect both the susceptibility to illness and the efficacy of treatments, and a physician who was also an astrologer, a combination that was not unusual in the university-trained medical tradition, would consult the planetary positions before prescribing treatment. This was not medicine. It was an elaborate way of generating random variation in treatment timing that occasionally, by chance, happened to coincide with the optimal treatment moment. The practical effect of all this, the beneficial herbal treatments combined with the harmful conventional treatments, the genuine empirical observation combined with the useless theoretical framework, was a medical system whose outcomes were considerably worse than modern medicine, but considerably better than pure chance. Patients who received good herbal nursing care for respiratory illness had better outcomes than patients who received aggressive bloodletting and purging, and the good herbal nursing care was primarily delivered not by physicians who were expensive, distant, and trained in the aggressive therapeutic interventions, but by the women of the household and community whose knowledge was practical, accumulated, and in many cases more effective than the professional alternative. The local healing woman, the wise woman of the village, who was consulted for illness, for difficult births, for wounds and injuries, for the various medical emergencies of daily life, was practicing a form of medicine that was at its best genuinely helpful and at its worst no more harmful than the professional alternative. Her knowledge was transmitted orally from older woman to younger, accumulated through observation of what worked and what didn't over generations. She had no theoretical framework that would satisfy a university examiner. She had something that was in some ways more valuable: reliable empirical knowledge of which plants, used in which ways, produced which effects on which conditions. The midwife occupied a similar position in the medical landscape, and her specific skills were particularly relevant to winter because childbirth did not pause for the season. A difficult winter birth, cold, dark conducted by firelight in a smoky room without any of the sterile conditions or emergency interventions of modern obstetrics was a genuine crisis whose management depended entirely on the skill and experience of the midwife and the supporting women around her. The medieval midwife, who had attended hundreds of births, knew things that the university-trained physician who had never attended a birth did not know. And her knowledge, in this specific context, was more practically useful. For wounds and injuries, which were common in the physical, tool-using, accident-prone environment of winter work, the household medical kit included honey for wound treatment, spider webs, whose fibrous structure provided a rough scaffold for clotting, and whose antimicrobial properties were not understood but were real, various herbal poultices for drawing out infection, and linen bandages. The treatment of wounds was empirical, learned from experience, and often surprisingly effective for minor injuries. For serious injuries, compound fractures, deep abdominal wounds, major blood vessel damage, medieval medicine had essentially nothing to offer, and the patient's survival depended on their own constitution and fortune. The role of prayer and religious ritual in medieval medicine should not be dismissed as simply superstitious, because it had real psychological effects. Even if it had no direct physiological ones, the experience of being prayed over, of having the community's spiritual attention focused on your recovery, of believing that supernatural assistance was available. These things reduce the anxiety and stress that themselves have negative effects on immune function. A patient who believed they were going to be well was in a better psychological state than one who had given up, and psychological state has real effects on physical recovery from illness. The medieval integration of religious and medical care was not just ignorance, it was a recognition, however imprecisely understood, that the mind and the body were connected in the patient's experience of illness. The monastery was often a more effective medical institution than the village healing woman, not necessarily because the monks knew more medicine, though some monasteries had genuine medical expertise, but because the monastery could provide what the village household could not: sustained nursing care, regular feeding, warmth, and the management of the sick person's environment over days and weeks. Recovery from serious illness in the medieval period required the same things it requires today: rest, warmth, adequate nutrition, hydration, and time. And the monastery infirmary, with its dedicated space, its experienced infirmarian, and its resources for providing sustained care, was better at delivering these things than the family household, where the sick person was one more demand on the attention and resources of people who were already stretched thin. The medical system that medieval peasants relied on through the winter was, in summary, partially effective, significantly harmful in its conventional treatments, genuinely valuable in its herbal and nursing care elements, deeply embedded in a theoretical framework that was wrong in its foundations, but right in some of its observational conclusions, and primarily delivered by women with practical knowledge, rather than by the university-trained physicians whose credentials gave them authority, but whose practices were, in many cases, counterproductive. It was the medicine that existed. People used it. Some of them got better. Some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't were about to meet them properly. Chapter 5. The diseases that hunted you. What actually killed medieval people in winter. Let's be honest about something that the popular narrative of medieval life is often reluctant to address directly. A lot of people died. Not everyone, not every winter, not in every community. But the mortality rates of the medieval period were genuinely high by modern standards, and winter was the season when those rates were highest. The median life expectancy figure that gets cited, 35 years, is somewhat misleading because it is heavily influenced by extremely high infant and child mortality that drags the average down dramatically. A medieval person who survived to age 20 had a reasonable prospect of reaching their 50s or even 60s. But infant mortality was catastrophic by modern standards. Perhaps a third of children died before their 5th birthday. and the diseases that killed them were disproportionately winter diseases. Let's look at the specific killers, because they are real, and they deserve to be named, rather than gestured at vaguely. Respiratory infections were the dominant winter killers, and they operated across a spectrum from the merely miserable to the genuinely lethal. The common cold, viral upper respiratory infection caused by a range of viruses, including rhinoviruses, coronaviruses. Yes, those have been around for a long time. And adenoviruses was as common in the medieval period as it is now. And while it was rarely lethal in itself in healthy adults, it created conditions: weakened respiratory defenses, increased mucus production, inflammation of the airways, that predisposed to secondary bacterial infections that were lethal. Pneumonia was one of the most important winter killers. Secondary bacterial pneumonia following a viral respiratory infection, the sequence where a cold or influenza weakens the respiratory defenses and allows bacteria to colonize the lungs, was a major cause of death, particularly in the very young, the very old, and anyone whose nutritional status was compromised. The symptoms of bacterial pneumonia: high fever, productive cough with purulent sputum, chest pain, difficulty breathing, the rapid deterioration of a patient who seemed to be recovering from a cold, were recognized in the medieval period, even if their cause was not understood. The treatment available: bed rest, warming herbs, hot poultices on the chest, prayer, was supportive care that helped some patients and was insufficient for those whose bacterial load overwhelmed their immune defenses. Medieval pneumonia, without antibiotics, killed a significant proportion of those it infected. Modern community-acquired pneumonia still kills people, despite antibiotic treatment. The pre-antibiotic mortality rate was enormously higher. A bacterial pneumonia in a malnourished elderly peasant in February, in a cold cottage with limited nursing resources and no antibiotics, had a mortality rate that reflected the biology of the situation. Survival was possible, but far from certain. Influenza. Actual influenza caused by the influenza virus, rather than the general cold that many people now describe as the flu, was another significant winter killer. Influenza is not a mild illness. Even modern seasonal influenza kills tens of thousands of people annually in developed countries with good healthcare access. Medieval influenza, striking a population with no vaccine, no antiviral treatments, and limited supportive care capacity, was considerably more lethal. The periodic pandemic influenza outbreaks of the medieval period, while not as catastrophically documented as the 1918 Spanish flu, produced measurable spikes in mortality, particularly among the elderly, the very young, and those with compromised immune systems from malnutrition. The malnutrition connection is critical and underemphasized. The late winter period, February and March, when food stores were depleted and the hungry gap was most acute, was exactly the period when nutritional compromise was most severe, and nutritional compromise has direct effects on immune function. A person who has been subsisting on inadequate calories, insufficient protein, and vitamin-deficient food for 2 months has a measurably impaired immune response compared to a well-nourished person. The immune system requires adequate protein to produce antibodies, adequate calories to maintain body temperature during fever, and adequate micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, to function optimally. The vitamin deficiency diseases of winter are worth specific mention. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, develops over the course of several months of inadequate vitamin C intake. Fresh fruit and vegetables are the primary dietary source of vitamin C, and in a winter diet consisting primarily of salt meat, dried legumes, bread, and stored root vegetables, which lose vitamin C content during storage, vitamin C intake could drop to genuinely deficient levels by late winter. The symptoms of scurvy, bleeding gums, skin hemorrhages, joint pain, weakness, or wound healing would have been present in at least some medieval peasants by the end of a long winter, even if they were not recognized as a specific deficiency disease. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was a disease of children in the medieval period, producing bone deformities, the characteristic bowing of the legs, that are visible in medieval skeletal remains. Vitamin D is produced in the skin through exposure to ultraviolet light, and in the northern European winters that we're discussing, where the sun angle is low, the days are short, and people spend most of their time indoors in dark cottages. Ultraviolet exposure was genuinely insufficient for adequate vitamin D production. The absence of vitamin D fortified foods, a modern intervention, meant that children's rickets was widespread, and adult vitamin D deficiency, with its effects on immune function and bone health, was probably common. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections were less seasonally concentrated than respiratory infections. They peaked in summer when contaminated water and food were more dangerous, but they were present year-round and could be lethal in winter when they struck nutritionally compromised patients. The combination of fever, fluid loss through diarrhea, and inability to eat in a patient who was already nutritionally marginal was a dangerous one. Rehydration therapy, the single most important intervention for diarrheal illness, was not systematically understood, though the instinct to give sick people fluids, including ale and herbal broths, was present. Wound infections were a year-round hazard, but particularly significant in winter, when the work of the farm and the house continued, and when cold-numbed hands and reduced visibility made accidents more likely. Medieval agricultural work, with its iron tools, its draft animals, its heavy equipment, its physical demands performed in difficult conditions, was genuinely dangerous. Cuts and abrasions that became infected were common. The infection of a wound in the medieval period could follow several trajectories. Most minor infections resolved on their own, or with basic wound care. Some progressed to serious local infections that spread along tissue planes, cellulitis, and some, particularly infections by particularly dangerous bacteria, progressed to septicemia, bloodstream infection, or to the specific condition called gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium bacteria, which was lethal without surgical intervention. Frostbite and hypothermia were winter-specific hazards that the medieval peasant had to navigate through outdoor work and inadequate clothing, working outdoors in extreme cold, tending animals, gathering fuel, making necessary journeys, exposed the extremities to temperatures that could cause tissue freezing. The extremities most at risk were fingers, toes, ears, and nose. The body's thermal regulation strategy of restricting blood flow to the extremities to protect core temperature left these areas vulnerable. Mild frostbite, frostnip, was common and survivable. Severe frostbite, producing tissue death and requiring amputation, was less common but real. The treatment available, rewarming the affected area, which is also what modern first aid prescribes, was partially correct, but could also be harmful if the rewarming was too rapid, or if the frostbitten tissue was refrozen after thawing. Hypothermia, the dangerous lowering of core body temperature, was a real hazard for anyone who was caught outdoors in extreme cold without adequate protection, who fell through ice, who became exhausted during cold weather physical work, or who was elderly, ill, or very young, and had impaired thermoregulation. The medieval understanding of hypothermia was empirical rather than theoretical. People knew that someone who was extremely cold and becoming confused needed to be warmed rapidly by any means available, including the body heat of other people, and the treatment was essentially correct. A person whose core temperature was dangerously low needed external heat, needed to be removed from the cold environment, and needed warm fluids if they were conscious enough to swallow. All of these were available in the medieval household. Childbirth in winter deserves specific mention as a cause of maternal mortality because winter births were particularly dangerous. The cold, the dark, the smoky atmosphere, the absence of any sterile conditions, and the limited mobility of the birth helpers in heavy winter clothing combined to make winter childbirth harder than summer birth. even by medieval standards, the primary killers in medieval childbirth, postpartum hemorrhage, and puerperal fever, infection of the uterus after delivery, were present year-round, but the infection risk was modulated by environmental conditions, and the cold and the damp of winter were not helpful. The specific vulnerability of children to winter illness deserves emphasis because child mortality drove much of the overall death rate. Children under 5 had immune systems that were not yet fully mature, nutritional requirements that were high relative to their small body mass, and limited reserves with which to fight serious illness, winter respiratory infections, croup, pneumonia, whooping cough, pertussis, which has a seasonal pattern peaking in winter, were particular killers of young children, and the medieval parents' experience of losing children to winter illness was not exceptional but normal. This normality was not accepted without grief. The evidence of medieval mourning for children is ample. But it was accepted as a feature of the world, and the psychological resources that medieval people developed for dealing with repeated child loss were part of the broader survival toolkit of the period. The Black Death of 1347 to 1352 and its subsequent recurrences deserve brief mention even in a discussion focused on ordinary medieval winter illness, because they permanently altered the population of medieval Europe and the context in which all subsequent medieval people experienced illness. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by flea bites from infected rodents, was not specifically a winter disease, but its demographic consequences reshaped the agricultural economy, the social organization of communities, and the nutritional resources available to survivors in ways that affected winter survival for generations after the initial outbreak. The labor shortages created by plague mortality drove up wages and improved material conditions for surviving peasants in ways that paradoxically made the post-plague generations somewhat better fed and somewhat better resourced for winter survival than their pre-plague predecessors. The seasonal mortality pattern of medieval populations, visible in the parish registers that begin to appear in the later medieval period and in the skeletal evidence of medieval cemeteries, shows the clear winter and early spring peak that the disease environment we've described would predict. Deaths from respiratory illness peaked in winter. Deaths from gastrointestinal illness peaked in summer. The vulnerable populations, infants, the elderly, the already ill, died at higher rates in the coldest months. This pattern is recognizable and consistent with the biological realities we've described. What is also recognizable in the same records is survival. Most people, most years have survived. The mortality rates were high by modern standards, but they were not catastrophic in any given year, except during epidemic events. The medieval peasant who made it through childhood had a reasonable prospect of surviving to a life stage where accumulated knowledge and community. Integration gave them additional resources for winter survival, and the community itself, the village as a collective entity, had developed strategies for winter survival that went beyond the individual household. It's time to meet that community properly. Chapter 6: The Community as Survival System. Why you couldn't do it alone. Here is a thing that is easy to miss when you read about medieval peasant life. The unit of survival was not the individual, and it was not even the family. It was the village. This is one of the most important and most consistently underappreciated facts about how medieval people survived winter, because the popular account of medieval life focuses on the individual household, the specific family, their specific cottage, their specific stores, in a way that implies a kind of rugged individual self-sufficiency that was not how the medieval village actually worked. The medieval village was a collective enterprise in almost every dimension that mattered for winter survival. The fields were organized collectively. The open field system, in which individual strips were distributed across shared fields, required coordinated plowing, planting, and harvesting decisions. The common pasture was managed collectively. Decisions about stocking rates and access were community decisions, not individual ones. The woodland rights were collective. The water rights were collective. The mills, essential for grinding grain into flour, were collective or seigneurial resources that served the whole community. And in winter, when the collective resources of the community were most needed and the vulnerabilities of individual households were most exposed, the community function became most critical. Let's start with labor sharing, because it was one of the most important forms of winter community support. A household that lost a working adult, to illness, to death, to an incapacitating injury, in winter lost a significant fraction of its labor capacity at exactly the moment when labor was most needed for the ongoing work of winter maintenance, keeping the fire going, feeding and watering the animals, hauling water and fuel, maintaining the basic functions of the household. The village community provided labor assistance to households in crisis. Neighbors helped with the work that the reduced household could not manage, in the expectation that the favor would be returned when their own circumstances required it. This mutual aid was not formalized in most cases. It operated through the informal social networks of village life, through the relationships between neighbors that had been built up over years of proximity and shared work, and the accumulated small exchanges of daily communal life. But it was real, and it was relied upon. The medieval village, in which every household was entirely self-sufficient and entirely separate from its neighbors in its winter survival strategy, was not a real medieval village. It was a fantasy of retrospective individualism imposed on a genuinely communal social structure. The sharing of fire was one of the most immediate and most important forms of community resource sharing in winter. Fire, the basic survival resource, was sometimes shared between households when one household's fire had gone out, and relighting from scratch was impractical or costly. The ember borrowed from a neighbor's hearth, carried in a pot or wrapped in cloth to retain its heat, was a genuine community resource transaction, small in itself but representative of the broader system of mutual dependence. Food sharing in winter was more complex than fire sharing because food was a scarcer resource with less margin for redistribution. Wealthy households, the richer peasants, the minor local gentry, the lord's household, were expected to demonstrate generosity at certain periods of the year, and winter was one of the primary contexts for this expected generosity. The tradition of the lord providing a feast for his tenants at Christmas, or the wealthy farmer sharing ale and food with neighbors and laborers at various winter festivals, was not purely ceremonial. It was a redistribution mechanism, providing a caloric supplement to households that might be running lean on their own stores. The church's role in winter food distribution deserves specific attention because it was both ideologically central and practically significant. Monasteries were the primary institutional providers of food charity in the medieval period, and the monastic tradition of providing bread and soup to the poor at the monastery gate. The dole, from the Old English proportion, was consistent across the period. A monastery that had substantial agricultural resources and managed its estates well was in a position to provide meaningful food assistance to the poor of the surrounding area, and the moral obligation to do so was central to the monastic understanding of its own purpose. The size and reliability of this monastic charity varied enormously by institution, by year, and by the specific circumstances of the monastery's own agricultural fortunes. A monastery that had itself experienced a poor harvest was not in a position to be generous with its neighbors. A wealthy and well-managed monastery could provide consistent winter food distribution to significant numbers of people. The records of individual monasteries' charitable distributions, where they survive, reveal a system that was patchy, variable, and often inadequate to the need, but that was genuinely present and genuinely helpful to the most vulnerable households. Parish churches also provided some food assistance, both through the priest's own resources and through the management of charitable bequests, gifts of money or grain made by wealthy parishioners for the specific purpose of providing winter relief to the poor. The records of parish charities, doles of bread, distributions of grain, payments to specific categories of poor, show a system of institutionalized local charity that was small in scale but widely distributed and consistent in its operation. The almshouse, a residential institution providing housing and basic sustenance to the elderly and destitute poor, was a medieval institution that addressed the most extreme form of winter vulnerability, people who had no household of their own to shelter them. Medieval almshouses were typically founded by wealthy individuals as a pious act, endowed with enough resources to maintain a small number of residents in basic comfort, and managed by the church or by civic authorities. They were genuinely better than the alternative, sleeping outdoors in winter, for the small number of people they could accommodate. Community healthcare in winter operated through several channels. The local healing woman we discussed in the previous chapter was embedded in a social network. She knew which households had sick members. She moved through the village providing assistance, and her knowledge was a community resource rather than a purely private service. The tradition of neighboring, visiting sick households to provide assistance, food, and company, was a genuine winter community practice, documented in the records of medieval communities as both a social obligation and a recognized form of mutual aid. The winter festival calendar served a social function that was genuinely important for community cohesion and for the psychological survival of people through the dark months. The medieval year was punctuated by a series of festivals, religious observances, saints' days, seasonal celebrations that brought the community together, provided occasions for communal eating and drinking and music and dancing, and broke the monotony and isolation of winter in ways that had real psychological benefits. Christmas itself was a 12-day festival running from December 25th to January 6th, the Epiphany. And in medieval communities, it was celebrated with a genuine enthusiasm that reflected both religious significance and the very practical human need for collective celebration in the darkest time of year. The Yule log, the large piece of wood that was ceremonially brought into the hall and burned through the festival period, was both a symbol and a practical heat source. The communal feast, the exchange of gifts, the gathering of neighbors and kin, these served the social bonding function that is visible in the anthropological literature on collective ritual across cultures, reinforcing the ties that made mutual aid possible when it was needed. Plough Monday, the traditional return to agricultural work after the Christmas festival, falling on the first Monday after Epiphany, was another community event, with the ceremonial plowing of a first furrow marking the community's collective re-engagement with the agricultural work cycle. The plow play and the associated collecting of money from householders for the village ale fund were community rituals that reinforced the collective identity and the mutual obligations of village membership. Candlemas, February 2nd, the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin, was one of the important midwinter markers, associated with the gradual return of light and with the assessment of how winter was going in terms of stores and agricultural prospects. The traditional saying associated with Candlemas: "If Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another fight. If Candlemas Day be clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again," reflects the anxious attention to weather signs that characterized the medieval winter. The community's shared weather watching, shared assessment of when spring might arrive, shared management of the remaining winter period. These were collective activities that bound people together. In their common vulnerability, the specific social institution of the winter ale drinking session, the gathering of neighbors in someone's house for communal drinking and conversation and perhaps music during the dark winter evenings, was a survival mechanism as well as a social pleasure. It conserved heat. Multiple bodies in one room were warmer than single bodies in multiple rooms. Conserved fuel, one fire instead of several, provided the social contact that was itself a psychological survival need, and created the context for the information exchange. Who needed what, who had what to spare, who was ill and needed assistance, that was essential to the community mutual aid system. The church itself was one of the few buildings in the medieval village that was solidly built of stone, and it was therefore one of the most thermally stable structures in the community. The weekly mass and the various additional services of the liturgical year brought the community together in the stone building that was better insulated than any of their homes, providing a community experience that combined religious observance with the practical benefit of collective warmth. The church was also the building most likely to have candles. Real wax candles, not the cheap tallow alternatives of the peasant cottage, which made the interior genuinely brighter than anything the village households could provide. The Lord's Manor House occupied a complicated position in the winter survival ecosystem of the medieval village. The Lord, whether resident or not, was the apex of the local social hierarchy, and his household was the largest, best resourced, and most thermally adequate structure in the village community. His relationship with his peasants included both exploitative elements, the rents and labor services that transferred resources upward in the hierarchy, and paternalistic elements, the traditional expectation that the Lord would provide protection, assistance in crisis, and seasonal hospitality. In winter, the paternalistic elements were most visible. The Lord's Christmas feast, to which tenants might be invited, or at which surplus food might be distributed, was both a genuine expression of the hospitality norms of the period and a carefully managed performance of lordly generosity that reinforced the social order while providing some material benefit to the people below it. The Lord, who failed to demonstrate seasonal generosity, who kept his stores entirely for himself and his household while his tenants were short, was violating a social expectation that was real enough to generate specific complaint and resentment. The physician, where one was available within reasonable distance, served the community as well as individual households, and the pattern of medical consultation in the medieval period was both individual and collective. An epidemic in the village, a cluster of illness cases that swept through multiple households in quick succession, was a community crisis that the community addressed collectively, both through the provision of nursing assistance to affected households and through the various prophylactic and apotropaic measures that medieval medicine prescribed for epidemic disease, which ranged from the empirically reasonable, like avoiding contact with infected people, to the magical, like specific prayers and ritual objects, to the actively harmful, like the blaming and persecution of specific community members for causing the illness through malicious magic. The collective memory of the community was itself a survival resource because it contained the accumulated experience of previous hard winters, knowledge about which food sources had proven reliable in past emergencies, which routes through the landscape were passable in specific weather conditions, which neighbors had skills or resources that might be called on in crisis, where emergency resources, the monastery, the market town, the charitable institution, could be reached and what they might provide. This collective memory was not written down. The medieval village was not a literate community in most cases, but it was real, transmitted orally through the stories of older community members who had survived previous crises and who carried the knowledge of how the community had managed them. The grandmother who remembered the hard winter of 40 years ago, who could say what they had eaten when the grain ran out and how they had managed the animals through the extended cold. She was a knowledge resource as valuable as the grain store itself. The village community, in summary, was the survival unit that made medieval winter possible. Individual households that were fully self-sufficient and never needed community support were the exception, not the norm. The norm was households embedded in networks of mutual obligation and mutual support, giving what they had when they had it, and drawing on the collective resources of the community when they needed to. The social glue that held this system together, the relationships of neighborhood, of kinship, of common religious practice, of shared festival and shared work, was maintained and reinforced continuously through the winter, because the alternative to maintaining it was isolation, and isolation in winter was genuinely dangerous. The medieval peasant survived winter not as an individual. They survived as a member of a community that was, in its combination of collective resource management, mutual aid, accumulated knowledge, and social cohesion, a genuinely sophisticated survival system. It was not a comfortable system. It was not a just system. the inequalities built into it were real and consequential, and the protection it provided was distributed very unequally along the lines of wealth and social position. But it worked most years for most people, and the people for whom it worked showed up in spring, ready to do it again. Chapter 7: The Mind Through the Dark. Psychology, Faith, and Surviving the Winter Inside Your Head. Here is something that survival guides, historical analyses, and documentaries about medieval life almost universally fail to address: the psychological dimension of winter. Not because it's unimportant, because it's invisible. You can measure a grain store. You can analyze the nutritional content of peas pottage. You can examine medieval skeletal remains for evidence of vitamin D deficiency. But the psychological experience of spending 4 to 5 months in a dark, cold, smoky room with the same 5 people and a pig, with very little to do in the evenings, with the constant low-level anxiety of uncertain stores and uncertain health, with the knowledge that the community around you includes people who are struggling and possibly dying. That experience is harder to quantify and has therefore been harder to take seriously as a factor in medieval winter survival. It was, nonetheless, real, and the resources that medieval people brought to it were more sophisticated and more effective than the popular account of medieval mental life, which tends to characterize it as either unreflective stoicism or abject superstitious terror, gives credit for. Let's start with the problem itself, because understanding what medieval people were psychologically dealing with in winter helps us understand why the solutions they developed were the solutions they developed. The darkness was primary. This cannot be overstated. In Northern Europe, England, France, Germany, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, the winter solstice produces days of 8 hours or fewer of usable daylight, and those hours are often further reduced by cloud cover. A medieval peasant in northern England in December had perhaps 7 hours of daylight, much of it dim and gray, and 17 hours of darkness. Those 17 hours were spent in the smoky interior of the cottage, lit by firelight and the occasional rushlight, in a space that was dark enough that reading, even if you could read, which most people couldn't, was difficult or impossible. The psychological effects of extended darkness are measurable and real. Seasonal affective disorder, the clinical depression that some people experience in response to reduced light exposure, is caused by disruption of circadian rhythms and serotonin and melatonin production that light exposure regulates. Medieval people did not have the term seasonal affective disorder, but they had the condition in varying degrees of severity. The lassitude, the low mood, the diminished energy and motivation that characterize seasonal depression were features of the medieval winter experience that the sources occasionally reference obliquely. The heaviness of spirit, the acedia, a spiritual sloth or torpor, that medieval theologians identified as one of the significant sins particularly associated with cold, dark winter periods, that religious writers warned against and prescribed remedies for. The remedies prescribed for acedia were, interestingly, almost entirely behavioral. The recommendation was to engage in physical work, to maintain the structured routine of prayer and activity, to seek the company of others, to avoid solitary brooding. These are, essentially, the behavioral interventions that modern psychology recommends for depression: activity, structure, social engagement. The medieval monk, who was told to get up and do his work rather than lying on his pallet, wallowing in spiritual torpor, was receiving advice that a modern cognitive behavioral therapist would endorse, for reasons the medieval theologian didn't understand, but that the accumulated observation of human behavior had discovered empirically. The physical confinement of winter was another psychological challenge that is easy to underestimate. Medieval peasants spent the warmer months outdoors, moving through a landscape that was familiar and that provided constant visual variety, physical engagement, and the sensory stimulation of the natural world. In winter, they were largely confined to a small, dark, smelly room. The psychological contrast between the mobility and openness of summer and the confinement and closure of winter was significant, and the irritability, the interpersonal friction, the cabin fever that resulted from months of enforced proximity with the same small group of people were recognized features of medieval winter that the sources record in various ways. The winter nights were long. 17 hours of darkness is a very long time to occupy without artificial light sufficient for detailed work, without books, without screens, without the full range of the diversions that modern people use to manage unstructured time. What did medieval peasants do in the long winter evenings? They talked. Storytelling. Oral narrative in all its forms, from the straightforward recounting of local news and gossip to the elaborate telling of traditional tales, legends, and narratives that had been passed down through the community, was the primary entertainment of medieval winter evenings, and it served multiple psychological functions. It provided mental stimulation, occupied attention, created shared emotional experiences, transmitted cultural knowledge and values, and created the sense of connection and collective identity that was itself psychologically sustaining. The tradition of the winter tale, the narrative that was specifically associated with the long dark evenings, the stories told around the fire, is embedded in the folklore and literature of virtually every Northern European culture. The fairy tale, the ghost story, the saint's life, the legend of the local landscape. These were winter genres, appropriate to the dark, the confined space, the heightened imagination that the combination of darkness and firelight and close company produced. The Brothers Grimm, collecting their fairy tales from German peasants in the early 19th century, were collecting material that had been told through winter evenings for centuries. And the specific qualities of those tales, their darkness, their moral urgency, their engagement with danger and survival, and the testing of character, reflect the psychological environment in which they were told. Music was another winter evening resource. Medieval peasants were not musically illiterate. They sang, they played simple instruments. The musical culture of the village was active and participatory rather than performative. The winter carol, the song associated with the Christmas season and the winter period generally, is one of the oldest surviving forms of English popular music, and it reflects the genuine musical culture of winter evenings. Singing together served the same functions that modern group singing serves. It regulated breathing, it created a sense of synchrony and shared experience among the participants. It lifted mood through the release of endorphins that singing produces, and it was free, requiring no materials and no resources beyond the human voice. Children were not, in the medieval period, insulated from the realities of winter in the way that modern child-rearing norms attempt to achieve. Children in the medieval village understood from an early age that winter was serious, that animals died, that people died, that the grain store had to last until spring, that their own survival was not guaranteed. This early exposure to the fundamental realities of existence was psychologically formative in ways that are difficult to evaluate from a modern perspective. It produced people who were less shocked by adversity than modern people tend to be, who had developed psychological resources for dealing with loss and hardship that the modern world, with its extensive insulation from these experiences, does not automatically provide. Games and physical play were part of the winter indoor culture as well. Medieval people played board games, chess, tables, an ancestor of backgammon, various dice games, in winter evenings, and the competitive engagement of game playing served psychological functions of stimulation and social connection. Children played the kinds of games that children have always played in confined spaces. Chasing games in the limited space of the cottage, simple toy-based play, the kind of imaginative play that children generate regardless of their material circumstances. The craft work of winter evenings served psychological functions alongside their practical ones. Spinning, which was the dominant female winter evening activity, required a degree of attention that prevented the worst excesses of idle brooding while leaving the mind sufficiently free for conversation and social engagement. The rhythmic, repetitive quality of spinning, the rotation of the spindle, the drawing out of the thread, has a meditative quality that the people who practiced it for hours daily would have recognized, even without the vocabulary of meditation. The hands were busy, the mind was partly occupied, and the social environment of the spinning group, women gathering to spin together, sharing conversation and the warmth of a common space, was one of the important female social institutions of medieval winter. Men's winter craft work, the repair and making of tools and equipment, the preparation of materials for spring, the maintenance of the household's physical infrastructure, served similar functions. The man who spent winter evenings repairing harness, carving wooden implements, sharpening and maintaining iron tools, was engaged in productive work that maintained a sense of purposeful activity and forward orientation. A psychological orientation toward the spring, toward the resumption of the agricultural cycle that was sustaining in the darkest months. Faith was the central psychological resource of the medieval period, and it deserves serious treatment rather than dismissive summary. The medieval peasants' relationship with Christianity was not simply a matter of formal religious observance. It was a total interpretive framework for understanding the world, including the world of winter suffering. Within that framework, the hardships of winter had meaning. They were part of God's ordering of the world. They were opportunities for patience and endurance and trust. They were the earthly trials that the Christian life required and that would be compensated in the life to come. This interpretive framework did real psychological work. The ability to understand suffering as meaningful, as part of a larger narrative that gave it purpose, is one of the most powerful psychological resources that humans possess. And the research of Viktor Frankl and others has shown that the capacity to find meaning in suffering is closely associated with psychological resilience and survival in extreme conditions. Medieval Christianity provided exactly this capacity at scale to the entire population through a shared narrative that made suffering not random and meaningless, but ordered and purposeful. The saints were particularly important as psychological resources in winter. The calendar of saints' days, with its regular distribution throughout the year, provided a framework of anticipated festivals and commemorations that structured the winter months and gave specific days significance and community celebration. The saints, to whom specific winter illnesses were prayed, the patron saints of specific conditions and specific needs, provided the sense that divine assistance was specifically available for the specific crisis being experienced. Saint Blaise was invoked for throat ailments. His feast day fell on February 3rd, perfectly timed, for winter throat illness. Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch were invoked for plague and epidemic illness. The Virgin Mary was invoked for all manner of need, but particularly for childbirth. These invocations were not simply superstition. They were acts of psychological engagement with the crisis, ways of mobilizing the sense of agency and connection that pure passivity denies. Prayer itself, the regular, structured practice of prayer that medieval Christianity prescribed, from the morning prayers that began the day to the compline prayers that ended it, served as a psychological regulation mechanism. The structured practice of prayer provided a reliable framework for the day, a moment of mental disengagement from the immediate anxieties of survival, a connection to a community of shared practice that transcended the specific difficulties of the moment. The modern research on meditation and mindfulness practice, showing that regular structured mental practices that direct attention away from ruminative worry toward the present moment have measurable benefits for psychological well-being, applies with appropriate adjustments for the specific content to the structured prayer practice of the medieval period. The relationship between the medieval peasant and death was different from the modern relationship, and this difference was psychologically relevant for winter survival. In a world with high mortality rates, where death was a regular presence in every community, and where most adults had experienced the death of children, siblings, parents, neighbors, and friends, the psychological defenses required were different. Medieval people were not less emotionally invested in the lives of those they loved. The evidence of medieval grief is ample and compelling, but they had developed through repeated exposure and through the theological framework that surrounded death with meaning and ritual. a relationship with mortality that was less catastrophically destabilizing than the modern encounter with death, which happens less frequently and is therefore less psychologically prepared for. The Ars Moriendi, the art of dying well, was a genuinely significant cultural tradition in the medieval period, generating a body of literature and practice devoted to the question of how to die in a manner consistent with Christian faith and dignity. The well-prepared death, the death that had been anticipated, spiritually prepared for, attended by the appropriate rituals of last rites and community presence, was, within the medieval framework, a good death. The preparation for a good death was part of the winter psychology of a population that knew winter was the season of highest mortality, and that the appropriate response was spiritual readiness rather than denial. This spiritual readiness was not fatalism. It was not the attitude that nothing could be done, and therefore nothing should be tried. It coexisted with the active, practical survival strategies we've been describing throughout this script. Medieval people both prepared their stores and prayed for survival. They both treated their illnesses with herbs and invoked saints. They both maintained their fires and asked God to keep their families safe. The practical and the spiritual were not alternatives, but complements, operating simultaneously and without contradiction in the medieval worldview. The pilgrimage tradition, while primarily a warmer season activity, winter roads were not conducive to long-distance travel, had its winter dimension in the votive behavior that preceded and followed pilgrimage. The vow made in winter illness: if I survive this, I will visit such and such shrine, I will make such and such offering, was a form of psychological contract with the divine that provided a sense of future orientation and hope in the acute crisis of illness. The vow turned the passive endurance of illness into an active engagement with recovery, with a specific future goal: the pilgrimage, providing a focal point for the desire to survive. The winter feast, the Christmas celebration, the gatherings at other midwinter festivals, was a psychological survival mechanism as much as a social and nutritional one. The act of deliberate celebration in the darkest time of year, of gathering, eating well, drinking, singing, telling stories, giving gifts, was a conscious assertion of life and community against the season's invitation to despair. You will not find this framed in those terms in the medieval sources, because the medieval analysis of Christmas was theological rather than psychological, but the function was real regardless of the framing, and the insistence on celebration in the dark was a form of collective psychological resilience that served the community's survival in ways that were not purely material. The medieval winter mind was not a simple thing. It was not purely stoic, not purely faithful, not purely fearful, not purely resigned. It was a mind equipped with the full range of human psychological resources: story and song and community and faith and humor and complaint and grief and hope. And it deployed those resources against the specific challenges that winter presented with the same pragmatic intelligence that it deployed against the specific challenges of food storage and fire management and wound treatment. It survived, most of it, most winters, and it arrived at spring with a very specific kind of relief that people who have never genuinely feared for their survival through winter cannot quite replicate. The relief of having made it through, of being on the other side, of watching the days lengthen and the ground soften, and the first green things push through the mud, knowing that the whole machinery of survival would get easier, at least for a while. Chapter 8. The Little Ice Age. When winter got worse and people adapted, we need to talk about something that complicates the already complicated picture we've been building. The winters that medieval peasants faced were not stable across the period. They changed. Specifically, they got worse. The period from roughly 1300 to 1850 is known to climate historians as the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling relative to the medieval warm period that preceded it, that produced lower average temperatures, more severe winters, and more frequent harvest failures across the northern hemisphere. The cooling was not catastrophic in the sense of producing permanently frozen conditions. It was, in terms of average temperature, a matter of perhaps 1 to 2 degrees Celsius relative to the preceding period, but in an agricultural economy operating without the safety margins that modern technology provides, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius was the difference between adequate harvests and frequent crop failures. The Little Ice Age was not evenly distributed across the period, and its effects were not felt uniformly across Europe. But its general tendency toward colder winters, shorter growing seasons, later springs, more variable and unpredictable weather is well established from multiple independent lines of evidence. Tree ring records showing reduced summer growth, ice core records showing changes in atmospheric composition, the advance of alpine glaciers, and the historical documentary record, which from the 13th century onward contains increasing references to severe winters, harvest failures, and climate-related social disruptions. The early 14th century saw some of the most catastrophic weather events of the medieval period, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. One of the most severe humanitarian disasters in medieval European history was triggered by a series of extremely wet growing seasons that ruined harvests across northern Europe for several consecutive years. The exact weather mechanism involved the jet stream patterns that determine northern European summer weather, producing the kind of persistently cold, wet summers that prevent grain from ripening properly. The result was crop failure on a massive scale, followed by the slaughter of breeding livestock for food, destroying the productive capacity that would be needed for recovery, followed by further crop failures, followed by starvation. The Great Famine killed between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe over the course of 8 years. It was followed, within a generation, by the Black Death. The combination of the two catastrophes, famine and plague, arriving within 20 years of each other, reshaped medieval European society in ways from which it did not recover until the late 15th century. But here is the point that is relevant to our winter survival story. People adapted. The medieval period's response to the deteriorating climate of the Little Ice Age was not simply passive suffering, but a series of adaptive responses, agricultural, social, technological, and culinary, that demonstrate the same practical intelligence that characterize the ordinary winter survival strategies we've been describing throughout this video. Agricultural adaptation to the cooler conditions of the Little Ice Age included a shift in crop mix, moving away from crops that required warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons toward more cold-tolerant varieties. Rye, which is more cold-tolerant than wheat and produces acceptable crops in conditions that would ruin a wheat harvest, became more dominant in the crop mix of Northern Europe during the Little Ice Age. Oats, even more cold-tolerant than rye, expanded in regions where the summer temperatures dropped too low for reliable grain ripening. The agricultural response was not a revolution. It was an incremental adjustment of the crop mix in a direction that the climate was pushing. The management of livestock for cold weather, survival also developed. Breeds adapted to cold conditions, hardier cattle, more cold-tolerant sheep, may have been selected for, though this is difficult to document from the historical record. The practice of bringing animals into the house in winter, which we've already discussed, became more universal and more important as the winters became more severe. The thermal contribution of indoor animals was more valuable in colder winters. Building improvements in response to the cooler conditions of the Little Ice Age are visible in the archaeological record of the later medieval period. The shift from the central hearth to the wall fireplace with a chimney, which improved both smoke management and the efficiency of heat retention in the room, became more widespread from the 13th century onward. The wall fireplace concentrated heat more effectively than the central hearth and directed it into the living space rather than allowing it to rise freely to the smoke hole. This was a genuine improvement in thermal efficiency, and its spread through the later medieval period may have been partly a response to the increasing need for effective heating as winters became more severe. The chimney itself was a technological development whose importance for winter survival is difficult to overstate. A chimney draws the smoke out of the room through a directed channel rather than allowing it to diffuse through the entire interior space before finding its way out. This dramatically improved the air quality of the medieval interior, reducing chronic smoke inhalation and the respiratory damage it caused. It also improved the thermal efficiency of the fire by creating a draft that made the fire burn more consistently and more completely. The spread of the chimney through medieval housing was slow. It appeared in wealthy and noble housing first, and filtered down through the social levels over the course of centuries. But its eventual adoption by peasant housing represented a genuine improvement in the conditions of winter survival. The development of better grain storage technology in response to the increased frequency of harvest failures during the Little Ice Age is also visible in the archaeological record. The construction of more substantial, better sealed grain stores, reducing the losses to moisture and rodents that could turn an adequate harvest into an insufficient one, was an adaptive response to the increased pressure on grain stores that more frequent bad harvests created. The expansion of preserved fish in the diet during the Little Ice Age reflects the increased importance of food sources that were independent of the annual harvest. Fish that could be caught, dried, and stored provided a buffer against the harvest failures that the climate made more frequent. The Hanseatic League's trade in dried cod and salted herring from the North Sea and Baltic fisheries expanded dramatically in the 13th and 14th centuries, partly in response to increasing demand from populations that needed reliable, preserved food sources in a period of agricultural instability. The role of the church in developing winter survival infrastructure during the Little Ice Age is worth noting. The monastery's role as a food distribution center, which we've already discussed, became more important as climate-driven harvest failures created more frequent local food emergencies. Monastic granaries, built on a scale that individual peasant households could not manage, served as reserves that could be drawn on in crisis years, and the monastic tradition of charitable food distribution was amplified in response to the increased frequency of need. The development of more sophisticated community grain reserves, the practice of maintaining a community grain store that could be accessed in crisis years, was another adaptive response, visible in the later medieval period. Some communities maintained collective reserves specifically for emergency distribution in bad harvest years, financed by contributions from the more prosperous members of the community in good years. This was a rudimentary but genuine form of community food insurance, spreading the risk of harvest failure across the community rather than leaving individual households to face it alone. The Black Death's demographic consequences paradoxically improved winter survival conditions for the surviving population in some respects. The massive reduction in population, perhaps a third to a half of European population in the initial outbreak and subsequent recurrences, left surviving households with access to more land per household, driving up wages, driving down rents, and improving the per capita availability of food resources. The peasants who survived the plague of the mid-14th century were, in material terms, better off than their pre-plague predecessors. They had more land, higher wages, and lower obligations. This improvement in material conditions translated into better nutrition, better winter food stores, and greater resilience against the remaining hazards of the Little Ice Age. The 15th century, despite being firmly within the Little Ice Age's temperature regime, saw some genuine improvements in the material conditions of the English peasantry in particular, partly as a consequence of the post-plague demographic adjustment, partly as a consequence of the gradual development of the market economy that gave peasants access to a wider range of goods, and partly as a consequence of the accumulated adaptive responses to the Little Ice Age that had been developing over the preceding century. The Little Ice Age also, in an indirect way, drove some of the technological and agricultural innovations that would eventually form the basis of early modern and then modern improvements in agricultural productivity and winter food security. The pressure of frequent harvest failures created incentives for agricultural experimentation and innovation, trying new crops, new cultivation techniques, new approaches to animal management that the more stable conditions of the medieval warm period had not provided. Some of these innovations, the improvement of root vegetable cultivation, the expansion of legume production, the development of better grain storage, had direct and immediate benefits for winter survival. Others were more long-term in their consequences, feeding into the agricultural revolution of the early modern period. The people who lived through the Little Ice Age winters, who experienced the severe cold spells that drove rivers to freeze and made travel impossible for weeks, who endured the crop failures that made the hungry gap of late winter into genuine famine, who managed their communities through the combined crises of climate deterioration and epidemic disease, were not simply victims of forces beyond their control. They were agents, adapting with the resources available to them, developing responses to the specific challenges of their specific moment with the same practical intelligence that characterized medieval peasant life more broadly. They adapted imperfectly. They suffered genuinely. The mortality of the Great Famine period was real and devastating, and no amount of adaptive intelligence prevented it. But the adaptation also happened, and the society that emerged from the combined crises of the 14th century was, in several measurable ways, more resilient and better equipped for winter survival than the society that preceded them. Chapter 9. What they knew that we've forgotten. The surprising wisdom of medieval winter survival. We've been through a lot. We've walked through the preparation, the shelter, the food, the medicine, the community, the psychology, and the climate adaptation that together constituted medieval winter survival. Now let's step back and ask the question that all this detail has been building toward. What can we actually learn from this? Not in the survivalist sense, not the list of medieval techniques that would be useful if civilization collapsed tomorrow, though some of them would be genuinely useful if civilization collapsed tomorrow, but in the broader sense of what the medieval approach to winter survival reveals about human knowledge, human community, and the relationship between intelligence and technology. The first thing medieval winter survival reveals is the difference between knowledge and technology. We consistently conflate these two things. We assume that people without our technology lacked knowledge, and that our technology reflects our knowledge. Medieval peasants had almost none of our technology. They had no thermostats, no antibiotics, no weather satellites, no refrigeration, no gas heating, no synthetic insulation. But they had knowledge, accumulated, refined, empirically tested knowledge about how to manage their environment, their food resources, their health, and their community. That was genuinely sophisticated and genuinely effective within its domain. The knowledge of how to manage a smoke fire safely through the night, how to bank coals to maintain warmth without burning the house down or consuming the fuel supply was real knowledge. The knowledge of how to read the signs of the oncoming winter in the behavior of animals and the character of the autumn weather was real knowledge. The knowledge of which plants to dry and in what quantities for winter medical use, which wounds needed cleaning and which would heal without intervention, when a fever required treatment and when it required waiting. All of this was real knowledge, accumulated through generations of observation and practice, transmitted through the community's oral tradition and through the practical training of daily life. The second thing medieval winter survival reveals is the survival value of community. We are, as a species, deeply social, and our deepest adaptations are social rather than individual. The individual human being without community is poorly equipped to survive in a difficult environment. We lack the fur, the claws, the speed, the specialized physical adaptations of other animals that survive in cold environments. What we have is the ability to cooperate, to share knowledge and resources, to coordinate activity in pursuit of collective goals, to maintain social networks that extend our effective resources far beyond what any individual can accumulate. Medieval winter survival was community survival. The village that maintained its mutual aid networks, that shared its labor in crisis, that mobilized its collective resources for the most vulnerable households, that kept the social fabric intact through the long months of confinement. That village survived better than a collection of isolated households with the same aggregate resources. The social investment that maintained those networks, the winter festivals, the communal work, the hospitality obligations, the regular religious gathering, was not separate from the survival strategy. It was the survival strategy. This has implications for how we think about the individualism of modern society and about the social infrastructure that we have built and sometimes failed to maintain. The medieval peasant who refused to participate in community mutual aid, who hoarded resources and neglected social obligations, was not being rational and self-interested. They were undermining the system that protected them in crisis. The village, as a unit of survival, worked because everyone participated in maintaining it, and the social pressure to participate, the norms and obligations and expectations of medieval village life, was itself a survival mechanism. The third thing medieval winter survival reveals is the value of preparation over response. The medieval peasant, who spent all year preparing for winter, accumulating food, fuel, medicine, social capital, was demonstrating an orientation toward the future that is one of the most powerful survival strategies available. The preparation was not pleasant. The summer work of curing meat and drying herbs and stacking fuel was additional labor on top of an already demanding agricultural routine. But it was the preparation, not the response, that determined whether the winter was survivable. Modern emergency management makes the same argument, that the investment in preparation before a crisis is far more effective than the investment in response after one. And the medieval experience supports it. The households that arrived at November fully prepared survived at higher rates than the households that arrived underprepared and then had to manage the crisis as it developed. The preparation window was the opportunity. By the time the crisis hit, the options for improving outcomes were limited. The fourth thing is the depth and sophistication of empirical knowledge that can be accumulated without scientific methodology. Medieval herbalism was not science in the modern sense. It lacked controlled trials. It lacked the ability to isolate active compounds. It lacked the theoretical framework that would have explained why specific plants worked. But it had centuries of accumulated observation. Generations of healers noticing that patients treated with specific plants did better than patients who didn't receive them. And that accumulated observation identified real pharmacological effects in a significant number of cases. The herbal pharmacopoeia of the medieval period was not entirely right. It contained plants that didn't work and plants that were harmful alongside plants that were genuinely effective. But it was not random guessing either. It was the product of careful, sustained, multi-generational attention to the effects of specific treatments on specific conditions, and it produced a body of practical knowledge that has been partially vindicated by modern pharmacological research. The elderberry, the willow bark, the garlic, the thyme. These were not superstition. They were empiricism without controlled experimental design, and they found real things. The fifth thing is the psychological resilience that comes from meaning, from interpreting hardship within a framework that gives it purpose. Medieval Christianity provided this framework comprehensively, and while modern people may or may not share the specific theological commitments that made it work, the psychological principle is general. People who can find meaning in their suffering, who can locate their difficulties within a larger narrative that gives those difficulties purpose, survive psychologically better than people who experience suffering as random and meaningless. The research on this is extensive and consistent. Viktor Frankl's observations in Nazi concentration camps, that the prisoners who maintained a sense of meaning and future orientation survived at higher rates than those who gave up meaning, have been confirmed and extended in multiple contexts. The medieval theological framework, for all its historical specificity, was providing something that the human psychological constitution genuinely needs, a story in which suffering makes sense and in which the sufferer's perseverance has value. The sixth and final thing that medieval winter survival reveals is something about the relationship between comfort and resilience. Medieval peasants were genuinely, constantly, substantially uncomfortable by modern standards. They were cold, they were often in pain from various ailments that we would treat. They were hungry at the end of long winters. They were doing physical work in conditions that modern health and safety regulations would prohibit. And they were doing all of it without the expectation that any of it should be otherwise. This tolerance for discomfort was not simply a limitation imposed by their circumstances. It was a psychological adaptation to their circumstances. a recalibration of the comfort threshold that allowed them to function effectively at levels of physical hardship that would be genuinely disabling for modern people who have not developed similar adaptations. The medieval peasant who got up before dawn in a cold cottage and went to do heavy physical work in freezing weather was not experiencing this as exceptional misery. It was normal, the normal of their world. There is something in this that is worth reflecting on. Not that we should seek discomfort for its own sake, or romanticize conditions that were genuinely limiting and genuinely harmful, but the medieval experience suggests that the human body and mind have a wider range of adaptation to difficult conditions than modern comfort culture allows us to discover. People can bear more than they think they can. Communities can maintain cohesion and function under pressures that seem, from a position of comfort, impossible to endure. The range of the tolerable is much wider than the comfortable, and medieval winter survival was, in large part, an exercise in discovering and inhabiting that range. Conclusion. March. You are still alive. It is March. The year is still 1270. The ground outside your cottage is doing what English ground does in March. It's that particular combination of not quite frozen and not quite thawed that produces mud of a depth and commitment that has to be experienced to be believed. The sky is the gray of old wool, but the days are longer. You can feel it, not in any dramatic way, not in warmth or brightness, but in the simple fact that when you wake up in the morning, the darkness is lighter than it was. The quality of the light is different. Something has changed. The grain store is at roughly a third of what it was in November. The salt pork barrel is down to the last few pieces. The root vegetables in the cellar have become philosophical about their own structural integrity. The ale is getting thin, but you are here. Your family is here. The children who were coughing in January are not coughing anymore. The cow made it through. The pig made it, though its opinion of the whole winter experience has been expressed continuously and at some volume. The fire is burning. The thatch held. You did not survive the winter by accident. You survived it because you prepared all year with the specific goal of arriving in March, with enough of the right things to still be alive. You survived it because you knew, genuinely knew, with the accumulated knowledge of generations behind you, what to eat, and what to do, and what to burn, and what to hang from the rafters, and what to put in the pot, and when to call on the healing woman, and when to pray to St. Blaise. You survived it because you were part of a community that was, in its own imperfect and unequal, and sometimes unkind way, looking out for you as you were looking out for it. And you survived it because you are a human being. And human beings have been surviving brutal winters without modern medicine for 10,000 years, before the medieval period, and for hundreds of years after it, which means this is not a problem that requires modern medicine to solve. It requires knowledge, community, preparation, and the specific kind of stubbornness that refuses to stop when stopping would be easier. The popular account of medieval peasant life presents it primarily as suffering, as a long exercise in endurance against conditions that were relentlessly terrible, with nothing to recommend it except eventual death and the occasional feast. And the suffering was real. We have not pretended otherwise. The cold was real. The hunger was real. The diseases were real. The people who died of them were real. None of this is romantic, but the intelligence that managed the suffering was also real. The community that cushioned it was real. The knowledge that treated it imperfectly but genuinely was real. The humor that lightened it, the medieval penchant for dark comedy, for finding the absurd in the difficult, for telling stories about the gap between how things should be and how they actually were, was real. The faith that gave it meaning was real. The love that survived it and made it survivable was real. The medieval peasant who made it to March was not lucky. They were prepared. They were connected. They were knowledgeable. They were stubborn in the specific way that survival requires. Not the stubbornness of refusing to acknowledge difficulty, but the stubbornness of acknowledging it fully and deciding to get through it anyway. The world that produced them, that trained them from childhood in the skills and knowledge and community participation that winter required, was not a world we would choose, but it was a world that worked most years for most people through a combination of human intelligence and human solidarity that deserves more credit than the word medieval usually allows. You look out at the March mud. Somewhere in the field beyond the cottage, the first tentative suggestions of green are appearing. The birds are louder than they were last week. The angle of the sun, low as it still is different. It is reaching further into the cottage, through the gaps in the wall, finding corners it hasn't lit since October. You begin to plan for spring. You begin to plan for next winter. You are a medieval peasant. You know what winter means. You know it will come again. You'll be ready.